The alien fleet entered human space. Then every star went dark. Part 1. The Threxil fleet came out of the dark between the stars like a slow tide of metal. 2,000 ships, moving in perfect formation, their hulls the color of old iron, and their engines glowing a dull blue. At the front of the fleet was the flagship, a massive vessel called the Voron's Wrath, and on its bridge stood Grand Admiral Korath, the man who had led 300 conquests and lost none of them. Korath was tall, even for a Threxil, with pale gray skin and eyes the color of a dying sun. He had spent 40 years in the Dominion's service, and in that time he had watched entire species surrender before a single shot was fired. He did not expect this campaign to be any different. The humans, as far as his scouts could tell, were a young species. They had only been in space for a few hundred years. Their weapons were simple. Their ships were slow. Their numbers, while large, were nothing compared to the endless legions of the Threxil Dominion. "Report," Korath said, his voice low and even. An officer named Vesic stepped forward. He was young, still eager to prove himself, and his hands trembled slightly as he read from his display. "Grand Admiral, our scouts confirm 41 inhabited systems within the border region alone, human colonies. Some are old, some are new. Their defense fleets are small compared to ours. We estimate total resistance will collapse within 6 months." 6 months, Korath repeated. He allowed himself a small smile. The Dominion has waited longer for smaller prizes. The humans were not entirely unknown to the Threxil. 2 centuries ago, a Threxil trade vessel had made contact with a human colony ship drifting near the edge of Dominion space. The humans on that ship had been polite, curious, and completely unprepared for what the galaxy actually was. The Dominion had taken note of them, catalogued their species, and moved on. Humanity had not been considered a threat then. There was no reason to consider them one now. But something about the reports troubled Vesic, though he could not say exactly what. The scouting data was too clean. Every human system they had surveyed looked calm, almost sleepy. No large military buildups. No new weapons detected. No sign that they even knew the Dominion was coming, though Threxil intelligence knew for a fact that human sensor arrays should have picked up the fleet's approach nearly 3 weeks earlier. "Grand Admiral," Vesic said carefully, "may I raise a concern?" Korath turned his head slightly. "Speak." "The humans should have detected us by now. Their listening posts on the border worlds have sensor ranges that would have caught our approach vector days ago. Yet there has been no response, no evacuation, no military mobilization. Nothing." Korath considered this. It was true that some species tried to run, or hide, or beg for peace when a Threxil fleet approached. It was less common, but not unheard of, for a species to simply do nothing, paralyzed by fear or disbelief. He had seen it before. A civilization too young to understand what was coming often did not know how to respond at all. "They are young," Korath said. "Perhaps they do not yet understand the danger, or perhaps they understand it too well, and fear has frozen them in place. Either way, it changes nothing. Continue the advance." The fleet moved on. Ship by ship, system by system, the Threxil pressed deeper into human territory. They passed by 3 uninhabited systems first, empty rocks and gas giants with no signs of life, exactly as the old survey data had predicted. Then they reached the outer edge of what the humans called the perimeter, a loose ring of small colonies and mining outposts that marked the beginning of true human space. The first colony they encountered was called New Alberta, a mining settlement on a moon orbiting a gas giant. It had a population of perhaps 20,000 people, mostly engineers and their families, along with a handful of orbital defense platforms that were, by Threxil standards, almost laughably weak. Korath expected the platforms to open fire, or to attempt a retreat, or to send a desperate call for help. Instead, as the fleet drew closer, sensors detected something strange. The lights on New Alberta's surface, visible even from orbit, began to switch off, not all at once, but in a slow, deliberate wave, as if someone were walking through the colony, turning out every light by hand. "What are they doing?" Vesic asked, watching the display. "Perhaps preparing for an attack they cannot win," Korath said, dimming their signature. "It will not save them." Within an hour, New Alberta went completely dark. No lights, no engine signatures, no communications. The defense platforms remained in orbit but showed no active power readings at all. It was as if the entire colony had simply switched itself off and gone to sleep. Korath ordered a boarding party to investigate. What they found was unsettling in its own quiet way. The colony was empty. Not destroyed, not damaged, simply empty. Every building was intact. Every system was powered down but functional. There were no bodies, no signs of struggle, no evidence of a hurried evacuation. It looked as though 20,000 people had simply packed up everything and left without leaving so much as a dropped tool behind. A ghost colony, Vesic muttered, standing in the empty streets with his scanner in hand. Where did they go? Korath, watching the feed from his ship, felt the first small stirring of unease he had felt in years. It was not fear, not yet. It was something closer to the feeling a predator gets when the forest goes suddenly and completely silent. He had led enough campaigns to know that silence was rarely a good sign. Continue the advance, he said again, though his voice had lost a little of its earlier confidence. We take the system as ordered. Over the next several days, the same pattern repeated itself at colony after colony. As the fleet approached, the lights went out. Populations vanished without a trace, leaving behind empty, functional cities. No resistance was offered. No communications were sent. It was as though the humans were retreating not just from battle but from existence itself, fading away like smoke the moment the Threxil drew near. By the time the fleet reached the fifth system, Korath had grown genuinely troubled. He called a council of his senior officers in the war room of the Voran's Wrath, a circular chamber lit by a soft blue light that was meant to be calming, but did little to ease the tension in the room. I want theories, Korath said, standing at the head of the table. Real theories, not comforting ones. A tactical officer named Draith spoke first. It could be a trap. They are luring us deeper into their space, drawing out our supply lines, waiting to strike when we are overextended. Possible, Korath said. But to what end? Even if they struck now, with everything we have committed, they could not defeat this fleet. 2,000 warships. They have perhaps 200 in this entire sector, and most of those are outdated. A science officer named Illyra spoke next. She was older than most on the bridge, with the calm, careful manner of someone who had seen a great many strange things across a long career. There is another possibility, Grand Admiral. What if this is not a retreat at all? What if it is a test? A test of what? Of us. Of what we will do when we find an empty colony. Perhaps they are watching to see how we behave, gathering information before they decide how to respond. Korath frowned. It was an uncomfortable thought, the idea that the hunter might in fact be the one being studied, but he set it aside. The Dominion had faced clever enemies before. Cleverness alone had never been enough to stop them. We proceed as planned, he said. We take the systems. We establish forward bases. If the humans wish to hide, let them hide. Eventually they will run out of places to run. The fleet pressed onward, deeper into the human sector known as the Soul Expanse, the region of space that held humanity's oldest and most populated colonies, and, at its very center, the birthplace of the species itself, the solar system called Sol, home to the planet Earth. It took the fleet 11 more days to reach the outer edge of the Soul Expanse. By then, over a dozen colonies had gone dark in the same eerie, orderly fashion. Korath had stopped ordering boarding parties to investigate each one. There was nothing new to find. Empty streets, powered-down systems. No bodies, no wreckage, no answers. What worried him more than the emptiness was what his sensors were beginning to detect at the edges of his scanning range. Strange energy readings, faint but growing stronger, radiating outward from somewhere deep in human space. Not weapons fire, not engine trails, something else, something his instruments struggled to categorize. It pulsed slowly, like a heartbeat, and it seemed to be spreading. Grand Admiral, Illyra reported one evening, her voice tighter than usual. The anomalous readings are increasing in both strength and frequency. Based on current trends, I estimate they will reach peak intensity in approximately 4 days. Peak intensity where? Illyra hesitated, centered on Sol itself, Grand Admiral, their homeworld system. Korath studied the star chart on the main display, the golden dot marking Sol glowing at the heart of a web of human colonies. 4 days. Whatever the humans were building toward, it was converging on their own home system, not on the Threxil fleet at all. That, more than anything else, struck him as deeply wrong. An enemy preparing a defense built its strength at the front lines, not at its own heart. Increase our advance speed, Korath ordered. I want to reach Sol before whatever they are planning is complete. The fleet surged forward, engines burning hotter, formations tightening, as they raced toward the golden star at the center of human civilization. Along the way, they passed more dead colonies, more empty cities, more silence. Korath began to notice something else too. The stars themselves, the background scatter of distant suns that had always filled his viewport, seemed subtly dimmer than star charts predicted they should be. He dismissed it at first, as sensor drift, a minor calibration error caused by the strange energy readings interfering with his instruments. But Illyra did not dismiss it. She ran the numbers 3 times, then a 4th, before she finally brought her findings to Korath in private, away from the rest of the bridge crew. Grand Admiral, I need to show you something, and I need you to understand that I have checked this data as thoroughly as I possibly can. Go on. She pulled up a star map, one that compared current sensor brightness readings against the historical catalog data the Dominion had on file for this sector. Star after star, the numbers did not match, not by a small margin, but by significant amounts. Stars that should have been bright, easily visible points of light, were reading as faint, weak, almost invisible, on long-range sensors. It is not sensor drift, Illyra said quietly. The stars in this sector are genuinely dimming, Grand Admiral. Real, measurable dimming, across dozens of systems, all at once. Korath stared at the map for a long moment, his mind working through possibilities and rejecting each one in turn. Stars did not simply dim on command. It was not something any technology he knew of could achieve, not across such distances, not so quickly, not so uniformly. How is this possible? He asked, more to himself than to her. I do not know, Illyra admitted. But Grand Admiral, if something has the power to dim stars across an entire sector of space, in a matter of days, in a coordinated pattern, then whatever it is not a weak or primitive civilization we are dealing with. We may need to reconsider everything we believe about this species. Korath said nothing for a long time. He looked out at the black of space beyond the viewport, at the stars that should have burned bright and steady, and now flickered like dying candles. For the first time in his long career, the Grand Admiral of the Dominion's greatest fleet felt something he had not felt in decades. Genuine uncertainty about what waited ahead. Continue toward Sol, he said finally, but sound full alert across the fleet. All ships, all crews, combat ready. Whatever the humans are doing, I want us prepared for anything. The order went out across 2,000 ships, and the Threxil fleet, still confident in its strength but now shadowed by a growing unease, pressed onward, toward the golden star at the heart of human space. Behind them, system after system continued to darken. Ahead of them, the strange pulsing energy grew stronger with every passing hour. 3 days later, as the fleet crossed into the final approach toward Sol, every single star visible on their sensors, across the entire sector, went dark at once. Not dimmed, not flickering. Dark, all of them, in the space of a single heartbeat, as though someone somewhere had reached out and simply switched off the lights of the galaxy itself. On the bridge of the Voron's Wrath, alarms began to scream, and Grand Admiral Korath, gripping the edge of his command console, stared out at a viewport that showed nothing but pure, endless black, and for the first time in his life, he did not know what to do next. The darkness lasted 11 seconds. To the crew of the Voron's Wrath, it felt much longer. When the stars returned, they were not the same. Every point of light on the sensor display flickered back into existence at once, but dimmer than before, as though a thin veil had been drawn across the entire sky. Grand Admiral Korath stood frozen at his console, staring at the viewport, his mind struggling to process what he had just witnessed. In 40 years of service, he had seen weapons that could crack a planet in half. He had seen fleets larger than cities burn to ash in minutes. He had never seen an entire sector of stars vanish and reappear like a held breath. "Status report," he said, and was faintly annoyed to hear his own voice shake. Vesic, pale and wide-eyed, read from his console, with visible effort to keep his voice steady. "Grand Admiral, all ships report system-wide sensor failure during the blackout. Engines, weapons, and navigation were unaffected. Only long-range and mid-range optical and energy sensors were disrupted. All systems have since returned to normal function, though readings remain inconsistent. Inconsistent how? Star brightness across the sector is now reading at roughly 60% of previous levels, Grand Admiral, and it is continuing to drop. Korath turned to Alira, who was working furiously at the science station, her earlier calm entirely gone, replaced by the focused intensity of someone trying to solve a puzzle before it killed her. Alira, explain this to me, now. She did not look up from her display. I have a theory, Grand Admiral, though I want to stress, it is only a theory. What we witnessed was not stars going out. Stars do not simply stop shining and then start again. I believe what we witnessed was something being placed between us and the stars, something vast, and something that can move, or activate, with extraordinary speed. A screen, Korath said slowly. You are suggesting someone has built a screen across an entire sector of space. Not a screen in the way you might imagine, Grand Admiral. Something far larger, based on the scale of the effect, and the number of stars affected simultaneously. I believe we may be looking at structures built directly around individual stars. Structures large enough to fully or partially enclose them. If such structures exist, and if they can open and close, even briefly, that would explain both the blackout and the current dimming. Vesic looked between them, his expression somewhere between disbelief and dread. You are saying the humans have built cages around their own suns. I am saying it is possible, Alira said carefully, and if it is true, the engineering required is beyond anything catalogued in Dominion records, beyond anything I have ever heard of, in any species, in any era. Korath sat down heavily in his command chair, something he rarely did during an active operation. He thought of the young species his scouts had reported. Simple weapons, slow ships, a species only a few hundred years into spaceflight, according to every record the Dominion possessed. That assessment now felt like a child's drawing, next to the truth of whatever lay ahead. Send a probe forward, he said finally, unmanned, full sensor suite, maximum speed. I want eyes on Sol before we commit the fleet any further. The probe launched within the hour, a sleek silver dart that vanished into the dim starlight ahead of the fleet. It took 9 hours to reach the outer edge of the Sol system and begin transmitting data back to the Voron's Wrath. What it found left the entire bridge crew in stunned silence. Sol, the star humans called their sun, was still there, still burning, but it was no longer visible in the way a normal star should be. Surrounding it, at a staggering distance, was a loose, shifting formation of countless small objects, so numerous that together they formed a faint, moving shell around the star itself. The probe's sensors could not get an exact count, but early estimates suggested millions of individual units, each one apparently capable of independent movement, arranged in a pattern that could open like a flower to let starlight through, or close like a fist to block it entirely. A swarm, Alira said, staring at the data with something close to awe. Not a single structure. A swarm of structures, surrounding their sun, capable of coordinated movement on a scale I did not think was possible. What is its purpose? Korath asked. I do not know for certain. But structures like this, surrounding a star at this scale, could theoretically capture enormous amounts of stellar energy, far more than any single planet could ever use for itself. If even a fraction of that energy is being stored or redirected, the humans could have access to power reserves that dwarf anything the Dominion has ever fielded. Korath felt the unease in his chest deepen into something closer to dread, though he kept his face carefully neutral for the sake of his crew. He thought back to the reports his own scouts had filed, years ago now, describing humanity as young, simple, unthreatening. He wondered how such an assessment could have been so completely, catastrophically wrong. Grand Admiral, Vesic said quietly, we are receiving a transmission. It is addressed directly to this fleet. Korath's head snapped up. Source? Unknown, Grand Admiral. The signal is not coming from any planet or ship we can detect. It appears to be originating from the structures surrounding Sol itself. Put it through. The bridge fell silent as the transmission began to play. It was not a threat, not a demand, not even, at first, particularly alarming. It was a voice, calm and measured, speaking in a language the ship's translation systems immediately began to process. The voice belonged, according to the translator's best analysis, to a human woman. This is Fleet Admiral Elena Voss, of the Sol Defense Command, speaking on behalf of the United Human Systems. To the commander of the fleet currently entering the Sol expanse, we have observed your approach for the past 31 days. We understand you are the Threxil Dominion, and we understand your history of expansion into inhabited systems. We wish to avoid conflict if it is at all possible. Before you proceed any further, we ask that you consider carefully what you have already seen, and what it means about the nature of the people you are approaching. We will speak again soon. The transmission ended. The bridge remained silent for a long moment. 31 days, Vesic said slowly. They have been watching us since before we even entered the outer colonies. And they did nothing, Korath said. No attack, no ambush. They evacuated their colonies without a fight, and simply watched us come. Illyra spoke carefully, choosing her words with the caution of someone stepping onto thin ice. Grand Admiral, if I may, a species that can build structures on the scale we have just witnessed, and yet chose to evacuate rather than fight, and chose to speak rather than strike. I do not believe we are dealing with a weak, frightened people hiding from a superior enemy. I believe we may be dealing with a people who have simply chosen, so far, not to use the full extent of what they possess. Korath said nothing. He understood the implication well enough. A predator that chooses not to bare its teeth is often more dangerous than one that does, because it means the predator has not yet felt the need to. He ordered the fleet to hold position at the edge of the Sol system, a decision that drew murmurs of surprise from several of his officers. In 300 conquests, Grand Admiral Korath had never once hesitated to press an advantage. But this, he told himself, was not a matter of courage. It was a matter of understanding the battlefield before committing to it. A commander who rushed forward blind, into a situation he did not understand, was not brave. He was simply a fool waiting to be proven one. Over the following 2 days, more transmissions arrived from the human admiral, each one calm, measured, and carefully informative. She explained, without ever directly threatening the fleet, the basic history of humanity's expansion into space. She described, in broad terms, a period roughly 150 years earlier that the humans referred to as the Dimming War, a conflict against another spacefaring civilization that had very nearly ended human existence entirely. She explained that in the aftermath of that war, humanity had made a decision as a species. Never again would they allow themselves to be caught unprepared. They built all of this, Vesic said, listening to the latest transmission with a mixture of fascination and dread. Because of a war, they nearly lost. All of this, the star structures, the technology, everything, because once, long ago, someone almost wiped them out. Fear is a powerful architect, Illyra said quietly, perhaps the most powerful there is. Korath found himself increasingly drawn to the words of Admiral Voss, not because he trusted her, but because everything she said matched what his own sensors were telling him. The star structures were real, the energy readings were real. The absolute absence of any hostile action from a civilization that clearly possessed the power to have already destroyed his fleet several times over was, in its own way, the most convincing evidence of all. On the third day, Korath made a decision that would have been unthinkable to him only a week earlier. He ordered a formal response transmission be sent, requesting a direct, real-time conversation with Admiral Voss, commander to commander, to discuss the situation before any further action was taken by either side. The response came within minutes. A single human ship, small compared to the Threxil warships but sleek and clearly advanced, detached itself from the swirling structures around Sol and began moving toward the edge of the fleet's position. It carried no weapons that Threxil sensors could detect. It came alone. They are sending one ship, Vesic said, disbelief plain in his voice. One ship, into the heart of our fleet. Confidence, Illyra murmured, or something else entirely. Korath watched the small human vessel approach on the main display, a lone point of light drifting steadily closer through space, still dimmed by whatever vast machinery surrounded the human homeworld. He thought of the empty colonies, the dead cities left perfectly intact, the calm and unwavering voice of the human admiral, the swarm of structures capable of dimming a star in the blink of an eye. For the first time since he had taken command of the Dominion's greatest fleet, Grand Admiral Korath did not know whether he was about to meet an enemy, or something far stranger, and far more dangerous than any enemy he had ever faced. A species that had already won a war so terrible it had reshaped everything about who they were, and had built themselves into something the galaxy had never seen before, quietly, patiently, and almost entirely unnoticed. "Prepare the docking bay," he said at last. "And Vesic, make sure every weapon on this ship remains powered down. Whatever else happens today, I do not intend to be the one who starts a war we clearly cannot win." The small human ship drifted closer through the dim, star-shadowed dark, carrying with it the answer to every question the Threxel fleet had been asking since the moment New Alberta's lights had gone out, one by one, in perfect, deliberate silence. The human ship docked in the belly of the Voron's Wrath with a soft, precise clamp of metal on metal, so smooth and quiet that several of the Threxel deck crew barely noticed it had happened at all. Grand Admiral Korath stood at the head of the docking bay, flanked by Vesic and Alira, along with a small honor guard he had ordered to remain visibly unarmed. It was a calculated risk, a gesture meant to show that the Dominion had come, for this meeting at least, in peace. He was not entirely certain the humans would notice, or care. The airlock hissed open, and Admiral Elena Voss stepped through. She was not what Korath expected. He had pictured, without quite admitting it to himself, someone imposing, someone who carried themselves with the weight of a species that had built machines capable of dimming stars. Instead, the woman who walked into the docking bay was of average human height, with short gray hair and a plain gray uniform, bearing no visible rank insignia beyond a small silver pin shaped like an open hand. She looked, more than anything, tired. Not weak, not frightened, simply tired, in the way of someone who had carried a great weight for a very long time. "Grand Admiral Korath," she said, her voice matching the calm, even tone from the transmissions. "Thank you for agreeing to meet." "Admiral Voss." Korath inclined his head slightly, an old Threxel gesture of cautious respect. "You came alone." "I did." She glanced around the docking bay, taking in the honor guard, the unarmed weapons, the careful arrangement Korath had ordered. "I appreciate that you came in peace as well. It tells me something about you that your reports did not." They spoke first in a small conference room, just off the docking bay, a space hastily cleared of Threxel equipment and fitted with a table and 2 chairs. An arrangement so simple, it felt almost absurd given the scale of what surrounded them. Korath found himself studying Voss carefully as she sat, looking for any sign of deception, any hint of a trap being prepared. He found none, which unsettled him more than if he had. "I will be direct," Korath said. "My fleet entered your space, with orders to secure new territory for the Dominion. That is not something I will pretend otherwise about. But I have also seen things in the past 4 days that no report prepared me for. Empty colonies, stars going dark, structures on a scale I did not believe possible. I would like to understand what I am dealing with before either of us makes a mistake we cannot undo." Voss nodded slowly, as though she had expected exactly this kind of honesty, and found it, in some small way, reassuring. "That is fair. I will be direct as well. What you saw was not a weapon aimed at your fleet, Grand Admiral. It was a test of a system we built for an entirely different purpose, one we have never before had to use at this scale." "Then explain it to me." She was quiet for a moment, choosing her words. 153 years ago, humanity encountered a civilization we called the Ashani. They were not so different from your Dominion in many ways. Older, more advanced, expanding outward in search of territory and resources. They found us at a time when we had barely left our own solar system. We had colonies on 2 other worlds, a handful of warships, and no real understanding of what we were facing. What happened? They attacked without warning. In 8 months, they destroyed both of our colonies and killed nearly 4 billion people. Not soldiers. Civilians. Entire cities, entire worlds, gone. By the time we managed to organize any real resistance, humanity had lost more than half of everyone alive beyond our homeworld. Voss's voice did not waver as she spoke, but something in her eyes made it clear this was not simply history to her. It was memory, passed down, carried, and never allowed to fade. We survived. Barely. It took us 11 more years of brutal fighting to finally drive the Ashani out of our space, and by the end of it, humanity had changed. We had been forced to change. Korath said nothing, letting her continue. After the war, our leaders made a decision. Never again would humanity be caught unprepared. Never again would we watch our worlds burn, because we lacked the strength to stop it. We began building. Not weapons first, though those came too, but infrastructure. Systems that could give us an overwhelming advantage the moment we needed one, without requiring us to maintain a massive standing military that would drain our people and our resources during peacetime. The structures around your star, Korath said. We call it the Veil, Voss confirmed. It began as a project to harvest stellar energy at an enormous scale, technology we adapted and expanded after the war. Over time, we realized the same structures that could gather that energy could also, when fully deployed, block a star's light entirely, and use the gathered energy for far more than simply powering our worlds. We built similar systems, smaller in scale, around every inhabited star in our territory. It took decades. It is still, even now, not finished everywhere. And when your fleet, your colonies, saw us approaching, they evacuated and activated it. Standard protocol. When an unidentified fleet of this size enters our space without prior contact, Voss said, evacuate the surface population to shelters, power down visible infrastructure, and prepare the Veil for potential activation. It is not an act of aggression, Grand Admiral. It is a precaution, born from a war that taught us precautions save lives. Korath sat back slightly, processing this. The blackout we experienced, every star in the sector, dark at once. That was a test? A full activation test, Voss said. We have never triggered it across the entire sector simultaneously before. When your fleet continued advancing toward Sol, despite the evacuations, despite every signal we sent that we did not wish for conflict, our command authorized a full demonstration. Partly to show you what we are capable of. Partly, I will admit, honestly, to see if it would even work as designed at that scale. We built it to defend against exactly the kind of overwhelming force your fleet represents. We hoped we would never actually need to find out if it worked. And now you know it does. Now we know it does, Voss agreed quietly. Elira, who had been listening from a seat near the door, finally spoke, her scientific curiosity overriding her caution. Admiral Voss, if I may ask, what exactly does the Veil do, beyond blocking light? Our sensors detected massive energy fluctuations during the event. Voss considered the question, then seemed to decide there was little point in secrecy at this stage. The Veil, when fully closed, does two things simultaneously. It blocks nearly all light and most forms of energy emission from escaping the enclosed system, which is useful for concealment and for denying an enemy accurate sensor data. At the same time, it redirects a portion of the star's own energy output into storage systems built into the structure itself, energy that can then be released in a controlled, directed manner. Released as what? Korath asked, though some part of him already suspected the answer and did not want to hear it confirmed. As a weapon, if necessary, Voss said simply. We call it a stellar discharge. We have only tested it twice, both times on a much smaller scale than what you saw at Sol, against uninhabited targets. I will not pretend I fully understand the theoretical upper limit of what a full-scale discharge from a system the size of the one around our homeworld could do. Our scientists have modeled it. The numbers are not comfortable to think about. The room fell silent. Korath looked at Vesic, who had gone very still, and at Elira, whose earlier scientific curiosity had visibly cooled into something closer to genuine concern. You are telling me, Korath said slowly, that if this meeting had gone differently, your homeworld star could have been used to destroy my entire fleet. I am telling you that it is possible, Voss said. I do not know for certain that it would have worked at that scale. I hope we never find out together. That is, in fact, exactly why I came here myself, alone, instead of simply allowing our automated defenses to make the decision for both of us. Korath studied her for a long moment. Why risk yourself this way? You could have stayed hidden behind your veil and let your fleet, if you have one, deal with us from a position of total safety. Voss's expression softened, just slightly, into something almost sad. Because I remember the Ashani, Grand Admiral. I remember what it cost us to become the kind of people who build weapons out of stars. I do not want that to be the first thing another species learns about humanity, if I can help it. I would rather you leave this system understanding that we do not want a war we would win. I would rather you leave understanding that we are, in the end, still trying very hard to be people worth knowing, even after everything that was done to us." For the first time since the fleet had entered human space, Grand Admiral Korath felt something shift inside his own long-held certainty about the galaxy, about conquest, about what strength truly meant. He had spent 40 years believing that strength was measured in ships, in weapons, in the willingness to take what one wanted from those too weak to stop you. Sitting across from this tired, quiet woman who commanded power capable of unmaking his entire fleet in an instant, and who had chosen, instead, to walk unarmed into the heart of that fleet simply to talk, he began to wonder if he had been measuring strength wrong his entire life. "Admiral Voss," he said finally, "I believe we have a great deal more to discuss." "I believe we do," she agreed. "But first, Grand Admiral, I think it is time I showed you exactly what you would be choosing to fight, if it comes to that. Not to threaten you, so that you understand, fully and completely, before either of us decides what happens next." She reached into a small case she had carried with her since boarding the ship, and pulled out a data drive, holding it out toward him across the table. "Everything is on here," she said. "The full history of the Veil, the full capability of our stellar discharge systems, as best our scientists understand them. I am trusting you with information that could, in theory, help you find a way to defeat us. I am trusting you because I believe understanding is the only path away from another war neither of our peoples truly wants." Korath looked at the drive for a long moment, before finally reaching out and taking it from her hand. The data drive sat on the table between them for a long moment, before Korath finally passed it to Alira, who took it with the careful reverence of someone handling something far more dangerous than its small size suggested. She left the room to begin analysis in a secure section of the ship, leaving Korath and Voss alone, with Vesic standing quietly near the door. "You understand," Korath said slowly, "that what you have just done could be seen as an act of extraordinary trust, or an act of extraordinary foolishness, depending on what my people choose to do with this information." "I understand that perfectly well," Voss said. "I have thought about very little else for the past 3 days. But I have also spent those 3 days watching your fleet, Grand Admiral. You held position outside our system for 2 full days, before requesting this meeting. You could have pressed forward. You could have attempted to force a resolution through strength, the way I understand your Dominion typically resolves these situations. You did not. That told me something important about you, and about what kind of choice I might actually have here." Korath said nothing, though he found himself, uncomfortably, agreeing with her assessment of his own decision, even though he had not fully articulated the reasoning behind it to himself until this moment. 300 conquests, and this was the first time he had chosen to wait, to talk, to understand, before acting. He was not entirely certain what had changed in him to make that possible. Perhaps it was simply that no enemy before this one had ever made him afraid enough to slow down and think. Word of the meeting had already begun spreading through the fleet by the time Alira returned, nearly 6 hours later, her expression grave and thoughtful in a way that made both Korath and Vesic straighten in their seats. "Grand Admiral," she said, "I have completed a preliminary analysis of the data. I want to be clear that this is preliminary. Fully understanding this technology could take our best engineers years, if it is even possible for us to replicate it all. But based on what I have seen, Admiral Voss was not exaggerating." "Tell me," Korath said. "The Veil structures around Sol contain an estimated 14 million individual units, each capable of independent movement and coordinated action through a distributed control network, unlike anything in Dominion records. Together, they are capable of fully enclosing their star, and when fully enclosed, the system can store and redirect a percentage of solar output that, if released in a focused discharge, would produce an energy yield roughly equivalent to—" Alira paused, glancing at her notes, as though hoping the numbers might have changed since she last checked them. "Equivalent to detonating our fleet's entire ordnance reserve, simultaneously, at every ship, multiple times over, in a single, sustained beam." The room went very quiet. "That is theoretical maximum output," Alira continued, "assuming full charge and a perfectly efficient discharge, neither of which the humans claim to have achieved in testing. Their own documentation notes significant energy loss during their 2 prior tests, and describes the system as, and I am quoting directly, A last resort weapon of uncertain reliability, intended to deter, rather than to be used. Uncertain reliability, Korath repeated. You are telling me they built a weapon capable of erasing this fleet from existence, and they themselves are not entirely sure it would work correctly. That is my assessment, Grand Admiral, yes. Vesic, who had remained mostly silent throughout the exchange, finally spoke, his voice quieter than usual. Grand Admiral, if I may, does it matter whether it would work perfectly? Even a partial success, even losing half our fleet in a single strike, would be a catastrophe unlike anything the Dominion has suffered in generations. We came here expecting to conquer a young, primitive species. We have found something else entirely. Korath turned to look at Voss, who had remained silent throughout Alira's report, watching the Threxil officers with an expression that held no triumph, no satisfaction at their obvious unease. If anything, she looked almost regretful. You could have simply let us discover this the hard way, Korath said. Waited for us to press the attack, and destroyed us, and let the rest of the Dominion learn to fear your name, the way other species fear ours. Why show us this instead? Voss was quiet for a moment before answering. Because that is exactly what the Ashani would have done, Grand Admiral. Let their enemies discover their strength through destruction, and rule through fear afterward. We fought a war against a civilization that believed strength was best proven through violence, and we won that war, eventually, at a terrible cost. I did not survive that war, and rebuild everything my people lost, just to become the very thing that nearly destroyed us. So instead, you show your enemy your greatest weapon, and hope they choose peace anyway. I show my enemy the truth, Voss corrected gently, and trust that a species capable of building an empire as vast as yours is also capable of recognizing when a war is not worth fighting. I am gambling, Grand Admiral, on the idea that intelligence and self-interest can sometimes lead to the same conclusion as compassion, even when the reasoning behind them is different. Korath considered this for a long time, turning the data drive's implications over in his mind, alongside the very real, very immediate question of what to do with 2,000 ships currently sitting on the doorstep of a civilization that could, potentially, destroy them all in a single stroke. He thought of the Dominion's council, far away across hundreds of light years, who had sent him here with orders to conquer, and who would expect either a new territory added to their maps, or a very good explanation for why that had not happened. Even if I chose peace today, Korath said slowly, the Dominion will send more fleets, larger ones. The Council does not easily accept failure, and they will not simply forget that a young species humiliated a Grand Admiral and turned away his forces without a single shot fired. I am aware of that risk, Voss said. It is one of the reasons I wanted this conversation to happen, and to happen honestly, rather than simply through a demonstration of force. I would rather your Council learn what they are dealing with from a report written by a commander who understands the full picture, than from rumors and half-truths that make us sound either weaker or more monstrous than we actually are. And what full picture would you have me report? Korath asked. That humanity is too dangerous to attack, and the Dominion should simply leave you alone? That would be a start, Voss said, with the faintest hint of something that might have been humor beneath the exhaustion in her voice. But I would also want you to report that humanity is not seeking conquest of its own. We have never sent a fleet beyond our own borders with the intention of taking another species' territory. Everything we have built, the veil, the discharge systems, all of it, exists purely for defense. We do not want your worlds, Grand Admiral. We want to be left in peace to rebuild what the Ashani took from us. If your Dominion can accept that, there is no reason our two peoples cannot simply exist, separately, without further conflict. Korath stood and walked to the small viewport in the corner of the room, looking out at the dim, star-shadowed dark that still hung over the Sol system, a lingering reminder of what he had witnessed days earlier. Somewhere out there, invisible at this distance, 14 million small machines drifted in careful formation around a star, capable of swallowing its light whole and turning its fire into a weapon beyond anything the Dominion had ever built. And somewhere behind him, in this small, plain room, sat the woman who commanded that power, and who had chosen, of all the options available to her, to simply talk. I will need to consult with my senior staff, Korath said finally. And I will need proof, verifiable proof, that what you have shown us represents the true extent of your capabilities. and not merely a fraction of it meant to intimidate us into a false sense of the danger. That is fair, Voss said. I can arrange for a supervised inspection of a smaller Veil installation, one further from our populated worlds, if that would help build the trust we need. I will not show you Earth itself, Grand Admiral. Some things I am not yet prepared to risk, even in the name of peace. But I can show you enough to satisfy your council that this is not a bluff. Korath nodded slowly, still looking out at the dark. There is one more thing I would ask of you, Admiral Voss, before I decide how to proceed. Ask it. Why us? Why show this mercy, this trust, to the very fleet that came here to conquer your worlds? Another commander might have simply demanded our surrender, or our immediate withdrawal, and left it at that. Voss rose from her chair, and came to stand beside him at the viewport, looking out at the same dim stars he had been watching. Because somewhere out there, Grand Admiral, is another Threxil fleet, and another, and eventually, if the Dominion keeps expanding the way it always has, one of them is going to find a species that cannot defend itself the way we can, a species that will not have a veil, or a discharge weapon, or any way to stop what comes next. I cannot save every species the Dominion might one day meet, but if showing you the truth today means the Dominion thinks twice before it expands into space it does not fully understand, then perhaps I have done something to help, in some small way, beyond just protecting my own people. For a long moment, neither of them spoke, the weight of her words settling over the small room like a physical thing. Korath, who had spent his entire career believing that the galaxy belonged to whoever was strong enough to take it, found himself, for the first time, genuinely uncertain whether that belief had ever truly served anyone well at all, including the Dominion itself. I will speak with my staff, he said again, quieter this time. And then, Admiral Voss, I believe it will be time for me to make a report to my council that will be very difficult for them to hear. Korath spent the next 2 days moving between meetings with his senior staff and cautious, careful exchanges with Admiral Voss, who remained aboard the Voran's Wrath as a guest rather than a prisoner, a decision that unsettled several of his officers almost as much as the existence of the Veil itself. It was one thing to hear about a species capable of turning stars into weapons. It was another thing entirely to watch that species representative walk calmly through Threxil corridors, unarmed, unafraid, treated with the careful respect one might extend to an equal, rather than a conquered enemy. Draith, the tactical officer who had first suggested the humans might be laying a trap, remained the most skeptical among the senior staff. Grand Admiral, I understand the evidence Illyra has presented. I do not dispute the numbers. But we are being asked to simply trust the word of a single human commander, based on a demonstration and a data file she chose to share with us. What if this is only a fraction of what they possess? What if the true purpose of this meeting is not honesty, but distraction, while their real fleet prepares elsewhere? It was a fair question, and Korath had asked himself some version of it a dozen times since Voss's ship had first docked. But 3 days of careful, cross-referenced analysis by Illyra's science team, combined with a supervised inspection of a smaller Veil installation on the edge of human space, exactly as Voss had promised, had produced no evidence of deception. The smaller installation, though modest compared to the one surrounding Sol, had demonstrated the same fundamental technology, the same capability to gather stellar energy and redirect it with terrifying precision. If it was a trick, it was one so elaborate and so consistent across every angle Illyra's team had examined that Korath found it difficult to believe any species, however advanced, could sustain such a deception without a single crack appearing somewhere in the evidence. I do not believe this is a trap, Draith, Korath said finally, during what would be the last of their private staff meetings before he composed his report to the Dominion Council. I believe we came here expecting to find prey, and instead found a species that spent a century and a half turning its own scars into armor. That is not deception. That is simply a truth we were not prepared to hear. In the end, the decision, though difficult, was not truly complicated. Korath had built his entire career on understanding when a fight could be won and when it could not, and every piece of evidence he had gathered pointed to the same uncomfortable conclusion. An assault on Sol, even with the full might of his fleet, carried a very real risk of catastrophic, near-total defeat, in exchange for a prize that offered the Dominion nothing but a graveyard of ships and a new, permanent enemy along its border. It was, by any measure he had ever used to judge a campaign, a fight not worth fighting. He ordered the fleet to withdraw. The order was met with confusion by some of his officers, quiet relief by others, and a grim, resigned understanding from most. 2,000 ships, which had entered human space 3 weeks earlier with confidence bordering on arrogance, turned slowly and began the long journey back toward Dominion territory, leaving behind a species they had once dismissed as young and simple, and now understood to be something far more complicated and far more dangerous than any report could have prepared them for. Before the fleet departed, Korath met with Admiral Voss one final time, in the same small conference room where their first conversation had taken place. "You are withdrawing," Voss said, though it was not quite a question. News traveled quickly, even across the careful, guarded boundary between their two peoples. "I am," Korath confirmed, "though I will not pretend this is the end of the matter. My council will not be pleased. There will be questions, investigations, perhaps even consequences for me personally. It is possible that a larger fleet will be sent in time, commanded by someone more willing to gamble everything on the chance that your veil is not as capable as it appears." "I understand that risk," Voss said. "I have understood it since before you and I ever spoke. But I would rather face that risk having tried honesty first than never having tried it at all." Korath studied her for a long moment, and found himself, somewhat to his own surprise, extending a hand in the human gesture of farewell that Vesic had briefed him on during their earlier meetings. Voss took it, her grip firm despite her evident exhaustion. "I will make my report as accurately as I can," Korath said. "I will tell my council what I have seen here, and what I believe it means. I cannot promise they will listen, but I can promise I will not lie to make this conflict seem simpler than it truly is." "That is all I could ask for, Grand Admiral," Voss said. "Perhaps, in time, it will be enough to keep both our peoples from making a mistake neither of us could take back." The Threxil fleet departed the Sol Expanse 3 days later, retreating back through the string of dark, empty colonies they had passed on their way in. As they left, the humans who had evacuated those colonies began quietly returning, and one by one, in the same slow, deliberate wave in which they had vanished, the lights of human civilization came back on behind the retreating fleet, a silent, steady reminder of exactly what had been protected and exactly what had been spared. Grand Admiral Korath's report to the Dominion Council was, as he had feared, met with a mixture of disbelief, anger, and, among the more cautious members of that ancient body, genuine alarm. It took months of careful presentation, supported by every scrap of data Illyra's team had gathered, before the Council fully accepted that the retreat from Sol had not been a failure of nerve, but a reasonable response to a genuine and overwhelming threat. Korath was not punished, in the end, though his career would never again carry quite the same easy confidence it once had. He had learned, in the dim, star-shadowed dark above Sol, that strength came in forms the Dominion had never fully accounted for, and that lesson stayed with him for the rest of his life. Word of what had happened at Sol spread slowly, first through Dominion military circles, then further, through the loose network of trade routes and diplomatic channels that connected the wider galaxy. Other species, hearing second-hand accounts of a young civilization that had turned its own star into a shield and a weapon rather than let history repeat itself, began to regard the corner of space marked on their star charts as human territory, with a new and careful respect. Some called it the Sol Exclusion, a quiet, unofficial agreement among many of the galaxy's major powers that whatever else might be said about humanity, expanding into their space uninvited was simply not worth the risk. Humanity itself did not seek to capitalize on this reputation, did not send fleets outward to claim new territory or demand tribute from frightened neighbors. Admiral Voss, and the generations of leaders who followed her, held firmly to the principle that had guided the Veil's construction from the very beginning. Strength existed to protect, not to conquer. Over the following decades, human colonies continued to grow, slowly and carefully, always within the protective reach of an expanding network of Veil installations, each new star given the same quiet promise that whatever had happened to their ancestors during the Dimming War would never be allowed to happen again. Years later, long after Grand Admiral Korath had retired from active service, he would sometimes tell the story of the fleet that entered human space, and the stars that went dark, to younger officers who found it difficult to believe that the Dominion, in all its vast power, had once turned away from a conquest simply because the truth of what they faced had been shown to them honestly by a tired woman with gray hair and a quiet, steady voice. They did not defeat us with weapons that day, he would tell them, standing before the same star charts that had once guided his fleet toward Sol. They defeated us with truth, and with the simple, terrifying possibility that they were exactly as strong as they claimed to be, and had chosen, despite that strength, not to use it against us unless we forced their hand. That is a harder thing to fight than any weapon I have ever faced, and I hope, for your sake, you never have to learn that lesson the way I did. And somewhere, far across the dim and quiet dark of space, around a golden star called Sol, the Veil continued its silent, patient watch, a promise kept by a species that had once nearly been erased from existence, and had decided, in the long years since, that the best way to ensure they were never erased again was not to become conquerors themselves, but simply to become, quietly and completely, impossible to destroy.